Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are so excited to be presenting this evening on our IES Practice Guides book study, our second event in this series. We are thankful to Dr. Graham for being here. We're thankful to our sponsors, Keys to Literacy. I am Jacqueline Surface. I'm vice president of the Reading League Maryland, and I'm so excited. This really like is a special thing for me because I was in the classroom for 16, 17 years teaching secondary language arts and intervention. So I know how much of a need we have in Maryland for all kinds of support, dealing with students coming in with all different backgrounds and needs. And I am so excited about this event. Last week's event was fantastic. So thank you for being here. Please consider following us on all of our social media platforms. Rachel will be sharing those in the chat, and I will do the same. This event is being recorded this evening, so if you want to keep your cameras off, we understand, although we'd love to see your smiling faces. And let's go ahead and get started. Okay, just a word from our sponsors, Keys to Literacy.
Good evening, everyone. I am Hope Rigby Wills. I'm a national literacy consultant and trainer at Keys to Literacy. I am incredibly excited to join you this evening to help kick off this important book study hosted by the Reading League Maryland. Thank you so much. This book study is focused on the IES practice guides for writing instruction. Keys to Literacy is thrilled to support this conversation as tonight's sponsor. And as part of our commitment to supporting educators across all grade levels, I'd like to briefly highlight two of the Keys to Literacy core writing programs. Keys to Early Writing is a foundational training for K-2 educators that covers oral language, handwriting, sentence structure, and early composition, all grounded in the science of reading. And then Keys to Content Writing is a flexible, evidence-based framework for explicit writing instruction across all content areas for grades 3 through 12. Both of the trainings are firmly grounded in the research and practices of tonight's speaker, Dr. Steve Graham. Next slide, please. I'll go ahead and voice over the next slide, which will pop up at some point. Jackie Hale is the Keys to Literacy Relationship Manager for the state of Maryland. So there's a QR code right there next to her picture, and that links directly to her Calendly, so you can schedule a call if you'd like more information. And then right next to that is the Keys to Literacy website, which is a treasure trove of resources and information about all things literacy. So switching gears just a bit, I am incredibly excited to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Steve Graham is a Regents and the Warner Professor in the Division of Leadership and Innovation in Teachers College at ASU. For 47 years, he has studied how writing develops, how to teach it effectively, and how writing can be used to support reading and learning. His research involves typically developing writers and students with special needs in both elementary and secondary schools, with much occurring in classrooms in urban schools. Dr. Graham is the former editor of Exceptional Children, Contemporary Educational Psychology, Journal of Writing Research, Focus on Exceptional Children, and Journal of Educational Psychology. He is the co-author of Handbook of Writing Research, Handbook of Learning Disabilities, the APA Handbook of Educational Psychology, Writing Better, Powerful Writing Strategies for All Students, and Making the Writing Process Work. He is also the author of 3 influential Carnegie Corporation reports, Writing Next, Writing to Read, and Informing Writing. So without further ado, Dr. Steve Graham.
Hi, how you guys doing? It's good to be back. For those of you who were not here last week, I lived for 23 years in Maryland and taught at the University of Maryland. So lived in the College Park area and then out towards Laurel off of the Baltimore Washington Parkway. So it's always good, no matter how you come home, to come home. And I do consider that to be um, the place that I always consider home because it's the longest place I've ever lived. Um, I need to mention something to the folks sponsoring this. For some reason, I'm the one admitting people into the room. I don't know if that's on purpose or that's not. And then the second thing that I want to mention is that Hope, who just introduced me, was my doctoral student at Vanderbilt when I was there. And I made the mistake of leaving for Arizona State University, and I was unable to get her to come and be a doctoral student there. Instead, she worked on uh, a doctoral program in speech and hearing at the University of Houston. And much to my chagrin, because I really wanted to have the opportunity to work with her again. I'm going to take a second and I'm going to bring up my slides. So hopefully this will go smoothly. We shall see.
And then I'm going to ask, as you're bringing that up, or before you get started, we do have some leftover questions from
Yes,
last session. So just let me know when you're ready for those.
I'm ready now.
Oh,
I'm
right.
assuming that
Awesome.
you can see this, my slides are up.
We can. Yes.
Okay, great.
Perfect. So yeah, somebody had put in the chat last time about their district using units of study, and so every day is kind of a different mini lesson, and that's kind of an I do, and then it ends up being like a you do and good luck. So she was worried that many complex skills cannot be accomplished in an entire gradual release cycle in a single day. And do you have any thoughts or better ways of handling that?
Well, she's absolutely right. If you're teaching something that's complex, it's going to take more than a single day. And even for some things that we might not think of being particularly complex, and we can, adequately show and have students practice in a short period of time, say like some aspect of spelling or grammar or sentence construction, it's important that we return to those. We sometimes assume that by showing and practicing once or twice in a single day, kids have it. And, they actually need to see and use that skill again, as well as using it in their writing. So one of the things when we used to do when we approached this from the point of view of teaching the self-regulated strategy development model, and this was particularly with younger kids, is that we would make our mini lessons 30 minutes a day, and they would be extended out over a 2.5 week period. But we'd be returning to work on the same thing each day, which typically involve planning and drafting, or in some instances, revising and editing strategies for writing. And so we didn't make that mini lesson go away. We just expanded it, and both in terms of time and also in terms of how often it happened. But I agree 100%. There are some things that take more time than 15 minutes. And, there are some things you can accomplish pretty well in 15 minutes. But I think that's a very astute observation on your part.
Thank you. And then our last question before you can get started on the next session here is, do you have any thoughts on the writing revolution, that program?
Yeah, I'm always a little hesitant about talking about other people's programs. And here's the reason why. I've worked with Read 180 on their writing part, and I work with McGraw-Hill on Open Court and several programs that they've developed. So, you have to be a little careful that, with what you say. I think the one thing I would say, maybe two things, and I'll go both in a positive direction and then something to think about. And I do think that we kind of got away from teaching sentence skills, and I think that's really important. I think it was a mistake. So when you look at Common Core, you don't see sentence construction mentioned. You see skills like grammar and stuff when you search through on this, but really nothing about how to create complex sentences in a facile way that meets your intention. And so one of the things that I think is an advantage is that they do a good job with that. And I think that that's important. The thing that I'd say, is a good thing to think about with any program, and you're going to see a slide that I'll share tonight, and I'll kind of get ahead of myself here with this, that is Yoda sitting at a seat at a blackboard and a teacher next to him, and there's a sentence diagramming thing where Yoda has incorrectly diagrammed a sentence about fear. And if for anybody who's a Star Wars fan, you may remember that for Anakin Skywalker, Yoda gives advice about fear, and the teacher's telling him it's incorrect. Well, this weekend I wrote a preface for a book, and I used that as my starting point. And it was a book on evidence-based practices in writing that's being done, put together by people in England in response to new work that they're doing around their writing framework. And I pointed out that when I saw that, the first thing I thought about is I smiled a little bit and chuckled. And then I thought, it took me back to when I was in fifth grade in a rural schoolroom in New Mexico. And we lived about 10 miles from a small town called Clovis. And our principal would come in every Thursday afternoon, and he would do sentence diagramming with us. And I got to tell you, I don't think I learned a thing. And the issue is that we didn't, it's not that, he did something wrong. He didn't. One of the people I had most admired in terms of research is a woman named Lynn Fuchs. And when I mentioned to her that sentence combining had no effect in terms of the literature that's available, she pointed out to me that that's how she learned to write. And I bet it is. She's very analytical. But the reason that I was particularly interested in this and with this example in terms of thinking about programs is we don't really have any information or evidence that it's a good idea to teach skills and wait before you start introducing paragraphs or longer pieces of text. You see kids that are 5 years old and 4 years old, and even if it's drawing or with a couple of letters, they're already creating text. We do not want to take them, at least in my opinion, out of that zone. And there are a number of studies that show that we can teach skills while we also have students write and engage them in being better writers. So that's something I would say with any program would be good to think about if you think it's drawing you away from having kids do any writing. So it was a really long, drawn out response on that one, but I couldn't pass Yoda up.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I'll let you get to your presentation tonight. Thank you.
Okay. So a number of years ago, the What Works Clearinghouse was set up through IES and by Congress to develop practice guides for teachers that were based on evidence. And this, in some ways, was a response to what was happening so much in writing, because writing has never quite got the attention that reading or math has gotten, but to worries that a lot of what was happening in schools was based, what you'd basically see if you walked in is a lot of practices that were being implemented that had no evidence or questionable evidence. And so, they were in a sense teaching lore. And don't get me wrong, there's plenty of things that I did when I was a teacher that I felt work based upon my experience with kids and watching them grow. So I'm not here to bash teaching lore. I think it's very important. But what we weren't seeing is things that had evidence that they worked in the classroom. And so the idea behind these practice guides was to review the evidence that was available, the very best evidence that was available, and draw recommendations for that. And last week I talked about the elementary practice guide, which was done before the secondary one. And one of the things that in the elementary one that the group of us who came together to do this were able to do is not only look at the evidence, but also draw upon our professional expert opinion and experience. This was not so much the case by the time we got to the secondary guide. So the three recommendations are based on evidence, not so much what the group of people had experienced in their own teaching practices or in terms of acquiring teaching lore. Now, there are some real advantages to these practice guides. One is that they're free and they're accessible online. And the secondary guide, particularly, is chock full of examples. And I'll have a little something to say about that in a minute. Also, the recommendations are really based on quality evidence. I do a lot of meta-analysis, and I have to say, we select studies based on certain criteria, but it's nowhere near as stringent as what the What Works Clearinghouse Guide did. So, in a sense, that's good and not so good. On the good side of it, it means that whatever is recommended based on evidence has very strong evidence. On a little bit less positive side is it limits the things that you can speak about because you have to have a reasonable amount of evidence to put something forward. The other thing is that the practice guides cover a broad range of academic areas. And as an example, there's, pictures of some of the covers of practice guides, but you can see they cover math, algebra, reading, they cover dropout. They even cover post-secondary stuff for those of you who work at the high school level and are interested in that transition from secondary schools to post-secondary. So in that sense, they're an invaluable resource for people. The secondary writing guide you see here, a little fuzzy in terms of how I see it coming out, in terms of copying it off. But, basically, we had a panel of 6 experts, so to speak. And I chaired this particular panel, and they also gave me some choice about who we invited. And so the first person I thought about is Carol Booth Olson, who just retired a couple of years ago. And I'm going to say a little bit about each of these people as we get into this. She's probably the most knowledgeable person I know about teaching secondary writing, and particularly to kids who are learning English as the language of school. Um, and she's done really massive projects in California um, with school systems in the LA area. She also was the main PI on the Wright Center, which just came to an end, but was a research center that IES funded for secondary writing. And just to keep your eyes open, we have a report that's coming out now that's making recommendations for teaching secondary writing. And if you're interested in research for that as well. Jill Fitzgerald is really phenomenal. Very, very, she's also retired. She was at the University of North Carolina at the time that we did this, has a lot of experience in terms of both reading and writing tended to be something very important in terms of our report, vocabulary instruction, and also things like revision. Linda Friedrich was at the National Writing Project at the time we were doing this, and she would have been considered, I think, kind of falling in both the research area as well as the practitioner area. Very, very strong, like Carol Booth Olson, in terms of her knowledge of how to teach. Katie Green was at high school in Forsyth County Schools in Georgia, which is in the Atlanta area, and really kept us grounded, maybe more than anybody else, because she was the only one still in schools. All of us had taught, but she was the only one still directly teaching in schools. And then Jimmy Kim, who actually worked with Carol Booth Olson at the University of California, Irvine, and is now at Harvard University. I love this guy. He does some of the best work available looking at knowledge building and using reading and writing as a vehicle for helping students become more knowledgeable. So that was kind of the expert end. This was done under the auspices of Mathematica, and you'll see, 4 people up there: Julie Bruch, Joshua Ferguson, Jula Lyska, and Claire Wilson. And in a lot of ways, these guys did the heavy lifting in a sense. Initially what we did as a group, including the people from Mathematica, is we set parameters for the type of research that we were going to look at. And that really involved just two types of research. Quasi-experimental studies where students or classes or schools were not randomly assigned to treatment or control, or true experiments where they were. We did a large search of the literature, and they usually do that for 10 years back, but we kind of thwarted them on that by giving them thousands of references that we wanted to have looked at, because we knew that going 10 years back wasn't going to yield as many papers or studies as we hoped it would. Then each of the studies that were located went through a rigorous evaluation, and that was farmed out in a sense. They had very strict criteria for what the reviewers looked at, and they provided training to those reviewers, and they would do a review and compute effect sizes of the studies that met WWC's criteria. And then from the studies that met those criteria, we drew implications. And there's already an error. It says 5 guidelines. It should be 3. And then we wrote the practice guide. And the way the practice guide was written is that um, we laid out for the Mathematica folks what the recommendations were going to be. We worked with them on what the evidence was going to be, whether it was strong, medium, or weak. And most importantly, we gave them tons of examples of things that met each of those criteria, and they were worked in to the guide. So more so than the elementary guide, which did have examples, but not as many. Now, there's a cautionary tale on this, though, and that is some of the examples. If you said, where's the research study that shows that this specific thing works? There's not for all of the examples. What they do is they give an example of how it can, that particular practice could be put in play. And so as one instance of this, if you look carefully in the guide, there's a schema called schema for goal setting. And that's something that I derive based on my work and using goal setting with students, but is basically a heuristic for helping students set goals. And we have plenty of research that shows that setting goals with students is beneficial for their writing, but that particular schema, as stated, wasn't tested specifically. So one of the cautions that I always give is that while I think this has some really great ideas in it and it's evidence-based, you always want to have a jaundiced eye towards anything that you apply from research in your classroom. And by that, I mean, don't assume that it's going to work just because it worked in a research study. What you want to do is make sure that you monitor its success with your students and make adjustments as necessary. And I never talk without saying that, because it can work great for some students, and maybe you've got a couple of kids in your class it's not working for. And then I guess I'll say one other thing on this that I didn't say last week, is that when you teach something, let's say a strategy in writing, um, how individual kids internalize that can differ. And so I'll give an example, because it's a little bit of a cautionary tale. And in none of these cases was it a particularly bad thing, but we kind of made an assumption that if we taught students a heuristic for revising, that they would use that heuristic in the same way. And so the revising procedure that we taught in this particular instance involved persuasive writing, and students had a series of things that they were reminded to do as they look back through their text. And this was done with only 3 students with a single case design approach. And what we found is that one of the students used the strategy just as we hoped they would. Another student, in his first drafts, he just made them shorter. And then when he got to revising, he used what he had learned and made it longer. But that wasn't our intention by any stretch of the imagination. And a third student stopped doing any surface level revisions once they used this strategy that was aimed at helping them with substantive things. So, it was a good lesson for us to learn that what we thought students were going to do, unless we looked carefully, may not be exactly what they do. Here's my Yoda cartoon. Um, Fear, will you feel I see? And obviously you could figure out what the actual sentence was. But I was asked to indicate any places where I do work that overlaps with the practice guide. So I did that in red so that you could see it. And I'll say a little bit about that. So the first recommendation, and this recommendation overlaps with the elementary guide, is to explicitly teach appropriate writing strategies using a model practice reflect instructional cycle. Now, this is the area with the strongest evidence, both at the elementary level and the secondary level. What we know for certain is if you want to help students become better writers, for their quality of their text to improve, teach them strategies for planning, goal setting, drafting, evaluating, revising, and editing. Um, and you'll see in parentheses down there within a process-oriented approach, which we'll talk about in a second. Um, so not only do we want to teach students strategies, but we want to make sure that they learn how to use the strategies we teach them in an appropriate and flexible manner so that they meet their intentions and the needs of their audience. And so we'll talk a little bit about each of these as we go. And I'm sometimes reminded, and I use this as an analogy, if you teach a strategy to students, whether it's a planning strategy, revising strategy, whatever, and 2 years later, the student hasn't upgraded that strategy in some way or is not mixing and matching it with other things to meet their intentions. It's like giving them a box initially that provides structure for writing or planning or drafting what they're going to say. But if they're not growing and that strategy is not changing, then what happens is it's like closing the box and they're trapped inside of it and they're not making the progress we'd like to see. So in terms of writing strategies, what are they? They're a series of actions. They can be mental, physical, or both that writers undertake to achieve their goals. Writing strategies can be used to plan, set goals, draft, evaluate, revise, and edit. Uh, Everybody uses strategies like this. Sometimes they're a little bizarre. So, if you look at somebody like Hemingway, Hemingway used to keep track of how much he wrote. He self-monitored in a sense or evaluated how much he wrote each day and he kept track of it. And if he met his goal, which he set for each day, then he could go out drinking that night. You have you have all kinds of bizarre strategies that expert writers use to kind of manage their environment and the process of writing. And students do the same thing. Obviously, we're not going to do a Hemingway strategy with kids. But when you take a look at the writing process, I'm not going to go through this because I'm sure you're all familiar with this. Um, but the basic idea here is that we want to be able to use this flexibly, these, planning, goal setting, drafting, evaluating, revising, and editing. But we always want to keep in mind what our purpose and our audience is. And so I've drawn that directly from the secondary guide. And I'm going to admit somebody else admitted it. So good. So I'd like to share with you a strategy that, did the screen just, yeah, okay. I'd like to share with you a strategy that Sue De La Paz and I developed that, and then I'll give you a way in which it can be upgraded and used with older kids. But this strategy was for writing opinion essays or persuasive writing or an argument, if you'd like. It could be used for any one of those. And the initial idea behind this is you have this mnemonic here, stop. And so what you often see with both elementary and secondary students when they write is as soon as you give them an assignment, they spend a minute, minute and a half, and they're off writing, so they're doing their planning as they go. And, some really great writers do the same thing. But writing often benefits from thinking about what you're going to do in advance. And so some things that are not on here is what's your purpose and what's your audience. Now, the audience part isn't here, but this does get a little bit to the purpose. So the stop was to get students to stop and plan before they write, but each of the steps was meant to serve a particular purpose. And so that first step, basically what they're doing is we're asking kids to consider each of the sides of an argument before they take a side. Now, this was something that I thought was a good idea. And, but what we basically found was that kids would generate ideas on each side, but they took the side that they were going to take originally. Rarely did they make a change in that. I was hoping that through some reflection that might change, but that's okay because the strategy worked really well in a couple of ways. By having students think through, their reasons for why this is, this side can be supported, and this side can be supported, and this side can be supported. It gives them a better idea of things that they're going to need to address when they write. Now, that consideration can be done as a whole class with the class generating ideas. It can be done with students working together. It can be done with a student working individually, or it can be done with source material as well. And so, at the time we developed this strategy initially, you didn't see much writing in middle schools, and that's what we were thinking about as middle school, sixth, seventh, and eighth grade. You didn't see much writing with source material, but since then we have used it in that way. So students would generate this information, and then we'd have them take a look back at their ideas and decide which side they thought they could make the strongest argument for. And they put a plus by the side that they were going to work on the notes that they generated. And then we used a simple way of helping them think about how to organize that. So we asked them to look for the side they were going to support, and any idea that they thought was going to be a strong, make a strong case for what they were going to present to their audience, they would put a star by it. And then they'd look at the other side or sides of the argument and put stars by the things they thought they most needed to refute or address to make their argument as strong as possible. Now, one of the things that you'll see is there's some prompts here. So for some students who weren't generating much, we might have them choose at least 3 ideas or 4 ideas that they were going to address. So, or 3 arguments to refute. So we individualize it somewhat for individual students. And then they would come up with an initial order by ordering what they were going to address first, second, third, just by numbering them. And as we modeled this, we modeled different ways of ordering that so that they participated and can see that in action. And then the fourth step of this was plan more as you write. So our experience has been, as we've taught students strategies for writing, whether they've been planning, revising, editing, etc., one of the things that happens is once students have a plan, they're off to the races, which is good, but they don't do any more planning. And so one of the things that we wanted to do is remind them that, you don't have to follow your plan religiously. You may get a better idea as you're writing. You may have new ideas that pop in. You want to keep this planning process going. We also asked them when they were done writing their essay, at least on the first draft, is to use DARE to remind them to look to see if they develop their topic sentence as supporting ideas, refute ideas on the other side, and add an ending. And so, that was just to make sure all the basic elements of a good persuasive text got in there. Now, we've extended this stop and dare strategy to high school students by making it more complex. So we'd have kids apply to stop and also ask them to determine how to attract the reader's attention at the start of the paper. Now, of course, that could have been done with middle school kids as well. Also, to better identify the problem so that the reader understands the issue. So by the time you're in 10th or 11th and 12th grade, when you're writing a persuasive text, you want to make it clear what the problem is, why it's important, and why you're addressing it. And then map the context of the problem, provide background information needed to understand the issues. And some of that can occur as you're presenting your reasons or you're refuting counter reasons. But as you can see, this is kind of you're not trapped in the box, you're continuing to go forward in terms of enhancing the strategy. And so this leads me to something else I'd like to mention. When we're talking about students in middle school and high school, usually with strategy instruction, it tends to be genre specific because genres differ in terms of their basic elements. Um, and we want to be sure that we're not having students learn like 70 strategies. You know, we want to be economical in terms of what we do. So, for example, if you were to use stop and dare in your school, one of the things that you might want to do is work with other teachers who are doing persuasive writing and, you know, come up with a strategy based on stop and dare that could be used across content areas with the idea, you know, the evidence is different and some of the things will be different, but the basic idea behind stop itself would be the same. So students aren't learning for every classroom a new strategy on how to write an argumentative text. So it's much better to be economical and think about this across, not across disciplines. Now, another strategy that you'll see in the handbook is one that has been tested, and it's called plan, and it's for informational genre. And you know, the thing to keep in mind, these like stop or plan are reminders. You know, they don't show everything that happens. And when we talk a little bit about teaching these, I'll try to make that a little bit clearer. They're a reminder to kids of the steps that you know you need to make sure you're engaging in. So in plan, the first step is pay attention to the writing assignment. Identify what you're asked to write about and how you should develop your essay. And I would add to that who your audience is going to be. And then in this case, it wasn't developed specifically for source material, but could be adapted for that, is to list your main ideas after gathering and evaluating ideas. And that could be, you know, from in your head, talking with others, looking at source material or some combination of that. And that would be an outline for that. And then you might add supporting details to that outline in note form throughout, and then number the order in which you present your ideas. And you're seeing, you know, this kind of numbering and, you know, taking notes in advance to get some organizational structure around what you're doing in play. CDO is a revising strategy, and basically what it involves is reading through your paper and ask if any of the following apply. And so this is the compare stage. The main topic of my paper is unclear. I present too few ideas on the topic. Part of my paper goes off topic. I don't provide enough information about some ideas. Now, the reason I presented this particular one is that all four of these could disappear and other criteria could be put in their place that you use. So, or it could be limited to two criteria. And then over time, another criteria is added, and as students start to master, you know, if main topic of the paper being clear is not a problem anymore, then that disappears. But it's one of those strategies that can be geared upwards or downwards as students progress through the year, progress through the grade levels. And so after you make your comparison, you make your decision about whether any of these are a problem, then you need to decide how you're going to rectify each of those issues or identify and implement your revisions. And we've done this where we've just used cards for this. So, you know, the rectify your diagnosis might be as simple as writing down what you think the problem is. Implementing your revisions would be you add something, you take something away, you rewrite something, or you move something. And so, you know, with any kind of strategy like this, you want to model it and model it more than once with students helping you use it, which now brings us to use a model, practice, reflect instructional cycle. And I'm going to skip to the next slide so we go straight to that. And for those of you who were here last week, and for most of you already know this basic thing. Basically, you want to model the strategy for students. And sometimes what that means for people is I do this one time. And the more complex the strategy, you know, if there's nuances that you want students to see, then you need to model it more than once. But it's very important that when you're modeling, students are engaged by helping you generate ideas, and they're actively involved in it. Otherwise, you're going to have kids who are sitting in the back of the room like I used to do when I was in middle school and high school. I was a master at disengagement. And so if there wasn't something that kept me actively engaged, I was doing something else in my head somewhere in the back of the room. So we want to model, and as we model, we want to think out loud. We want to talk to ourselves so students can see what's going on and how you use this process. We want to practice, and that means more than practicing it once. Typically, what we do is we have students practice together, and if there's anything like graphic organizers that help direct their use of this, we have them do that. And then when we think or they think they can do this, by themselves, then they move to that, and any prompts that are there to help them, we start removing. Usually we find, in about 3 or 4 practices, most kids can use the strategies we're talking about successfully. Um, and we want to have them reflect. So one of the things like where that, for the stop strategy where, keep planning as you're writing, that was something that kids recommended to us. The dare part in terms of evaluating to make sure you have all the basic elements in there. We saw kids doing that when we were working with them on a 6th grade report. And so we've incorporated that in. But kids often have really great suggestions when you initially present a strategy or once you're kind of wrapping it up about how to make this work. Another thing that we've done over the years that you might want to think about doing is we have students identify something that they've learned. It might involve goal setting while they're using a strategy, self-assessment, or some aspect of the strategy, and they identify somewhere else where they can use it, and they talk with a peer about how to apply it. And then, yeah, in a couple of days, they have to come back and tell us what they did. Now, kids can come back and BS you. Some do. But what we found in studies, even with kids as young as 2nd grade, by having them do that, they maintained what they learned and generalized it to other types of writing better than kids who did not do that. Um, in terms of teaching strategies, I'm going to spend a little time with the self-regulated strategy development model, which was developed by my wife, Karen Harris. We've worked together on this for a long period of time. I think the first study was published in 1985, so I think it was done in 1984. Um, but in this, students are taught task-specific strategies for accomplishing a task, like planning and drafting a story. The knowledge needed to use these strategies, and I'll illustrate this in a second, and self-regulation procedures needed to regulate the strategies, writing process, and writing behaviors. So what this involves is the following stages. Sometimes background knowledge and discuss it are combined, but often what we do is we'll start with something that students will read. Like if we're working on writing an informational text, then we'll look at some informational text that would serve as model text. And we have students work in pairs to decide, what makes that a good text, and we talk about that. And in that discussion, we make sure that kids not only point out things, like good word choice, etc., but the elements of our strategy that are important that make text strong, we make sure we get there, even if we have to do a little prompting to do that. In terms of discussing it, we're presenting the strategy and talking about um, each of the steps or stages or the heuristic parts of it and how they might help you, and asking kids to also weigh in on that. Sometimes we talk with them about how they're approaching a task as well, so that they can see how this differs. Then we model it, like I was saying, thinking out loud, and we often model more than one time. If there's something like stop that's a mnemonic, we make sure, starting right from the start, as soon as we describe it, I have it stuck down here as memorize it. We make sure that students can tell us what those what each of those steps stand for, like in plan or stop or CDO. And then support it is practicing it. And then independence use, where they do it by themselves, they can do it successfully, and their paper has the basic elements in it that the strategy works on, and it's improved as well. Now, as we go along, we introduce goal setting, self-monitoring, self-reinforcement, and sometimes self-statements with older kids, but not always. With goal setting, what we're having students do is to set goals. We set goals sometimes with them about what we'll do to help them learn the strategy where they're involved, but we also sometimes will ask them to set goals for what they'll do. We also set goals if, like the stop and dare strategy, let's say we had that goal for having 4 things that you're going to support on your side of the argument. They'll set a goal to include those 4 things and maybe to refute 2 or 3 goals on the other side, and they self-monitor. And in some instances, we have them keep track of how they're doing. And so before we start instruction, we have them write something. And then after, when we model, we chart, how well we've done, like the number of reasons that we've talked about for supporting and equality, the number of refutations. And then what we do is compare it to what they did initially. And then we continue to chart so that they can see their progress. And one of the things that we do constantly is we talk about it's the use of the strategy while you're doing well, and it's the effort that you put into it. We always talk about effort and strategy going together. And we work with them about, we don't try to get them to stop saying negative things to themselves about writing. What we do is we look for them to say, we might work on some things that they can say to themselves or will say to them that reinforce, the progress that they're making. I want to share one other thing with you. This is in the handbook. This is from Carol Booth Olson's work. These are a lot of different kinds of strategies that we use for both reading and writing, which will give us a jump into the next thing. What they typically do is they model this and students practice a couple of times, not quite as much practice, but they're covering a lot of territory there. But her work is really worth taking a look at. The second recommendation was to integrate writing and reading to emphasize key writing features. And this was also, there was not strong evidence, but moderate evidence on this. And one of the things that I mentioned last week is in terms of kind of new evidence at the elementary level is that we've amassed a pretty strong evidence base now that having students write about what they read or what they learn and teaching writing makes you a better reader and vice versa. And so this is the basic premise of these. And one of the points on this was to teach students to understand that both writers and readers use similar knowledge and skills to create meaning. So both reading and writing are meaning activities, but we draw on the same body of knowledge and cognitive processes. And the way that this is kind of presented from a theoretical point of view is a shared knowledge of assets that we have as learners that we can bring to both reading and writing. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying they're the same thing. They're not. They differ, but they draw upon the same knowledge base and cognitive processes. And the important part of that is that enhancing, say, like the coding skills with young kids enhances spelling or vice versa, or helping students who are older become more, say, familiar if you're going to work on something on mystery writing. Once students become familiar with the purposes and the elements of mystery writing, then that actually helps them better understand mysteries that they read and vice versa. Because when you read a mystery and you know what its parts are, it gives you a place to kind of interpret the story and hang ideas on. So, basically the idea here is that improvements in one should result in improvements in others. And that's what the evidence pretty much says. And so one of the examples of something of an activity from the guide that I particularly like is select story impression words and phrases. And this gave the example, The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, which is suggesting a murder scenario. Story impressions are keywords and phrases that drive a narrative. And so that means you go through and you look for these key impressions that you order as they occur in the story that you think your students can write a similar story to. Obviously, it's not going to be the same story. But what they then do is they write their story and then they compare it back to Edgar Allan Poe's story. So it gives them a chance to look at how they write and how Poe wrote his. you could do the same thing with students and you selecting the impression words from a story, but the students write a different story. You set, a different time or different characters or different place, and they write a story, and you make that connection between reading and writing. Um, their second part of this recommendation was to use a variety of written exemplars to highlight the key features of text. And so, this is going to be pretty familiar to most people, but this is emulating model text basically. So remember when I was talking about when we do SRSD, we look at, model text and we evaluate them to see what makes them good. And then, in essence, that's providing the platform for students to know what constitutes a good text in that area and then to emulate it. And so that's basically the same thing here is present a model of a particular type of text to students. Now, I want to give a little caution on this. So if your model is Edgar Allan Poe, who was an exceptional writer, um, I don't think your students are probably going to write like Edgar Allan Poe, unless you've got somebody who's really gifted in your class. But generally, that's not going to happen. So sometimes the models that we give are too high. They're a bar set above where students are going to be able to operate. So one of the things that we've increasingly done in our own work is over time we've collected texts that students have written, and particularly texts that we think are really good, and we've gussied them up a little bit. If there's miscues in them, we've taken them out, but we've created model texts that students can actually emulate and move towards versus something they can only move this much towards versus something they can move this much towards. So something to think about. You have students read and identify what makes it a strong text, and that I think is typically best done as a group, in small groups or as a class. But I particularly like this in small groups, with small groups coming back together. And then you repeat with another strong text in the same genre. Now, if you want to add a twist to this, something that we've been doing frequently now is we have some texts in that genre that are not so good, and students start identifying what would make it better using the criteria for a strong text. And a lot of kids, not all, but a lot of kids enjoy taking another text apart. And now the twist is you can have AI generated text that you take apart or look at as well. And so that's the weak part down there. And then make a list of the features of the positive genre things, and that could be done above. And then ask students to emulate and to share their writing with each other, at least a little part of it, so that it becomes a little bit more public for those who want to share. Um, the third recommendation centered around um, using assessment. And, not surprisingly, that's going to involve feedback and monitoring students' progress. And so one of the things is that and the evidence for this was minimal. It wasn't strong, wasn't moderate, it was minimal. Now I think we have stronger evidence now for feedback on students' writing, but it's probably less strong in terms of some of the things that I'm going to say here, especially 3A. Assess students' strengths and areas for improvement before teaching a new strategy or skills. So if you've got a class and everybody writes a pretty good persuasive essay, then there's no need to have a strategy like the stop and dare one that we looked at earlier. Um, but by assessing what students do, it'll give you some ideas of things that you want to teach, or if there's something you're going to teach, how you may want to modify it. So, what you're looking at in terms of something students write, what they did well in terms of their pretest. Now, if I was looking at, like a planning strategy, I'd ask them to plan in advance and tell them that they need to do that. And then I would look at that as well as their text. What did students not do well and what are they having difficulty with? Things I need to teach or my students need to practice. And so, this is one way to kind of approach the assessment in is we look at what students can do up front, and then we make decisions about what we need to do. Um, Another way of kind of approaching this is we analyze students' writing to tailor instruction and target feedback. So as students write, we look at what they do and we give feedback on that. And so that can be done by the teacher. It can be done by peers, but you have to teach them how to do that and the criteria they're going to use. We can teach students to evaluate their own writing, and it also can be done by machine now. And you know, to be truthful about this, AI is not bad on this right now, and it's going to get better, and there'll be dedicated AI systems that I think schools will eventually have that will give pretty good feedback, and you know, that will ease teachers what teachers have to do. So one of the kickbacks that I get often, I used to say, we need to double the amount of time that students spend writing. And administrators would say, we can't do that because teachers don't have the time to give feedback. And my response is always, you don't have to give feedback on everything. And you have peers and you have self-feedback that can operate. And I think over time we'll have some help that's reasonable from AI. Um, we also want to monitor students' progress while teaching writing strategy skills or they progress. So one of the things that I didn't mention to you is that when we did that stop and dare strategy, what we would have students do is they would monitor how many reasons they included in each of their papers and how many counter reasons that they did. And they in some instances, we'd ask them to rate it. Now, we could also do that, but by looking at what they did, um, you know, it gave us an idea of, well, maybe we needed a little bit more work on counter reasons because they're not, you know, addressing that very often. Or maybe they have, you know, if you get a kid with 10 reasons in an essay and it's a page long, well, you know, there's very little elaboration. So that's another place that we can look. And so we monitor over time to see if we need to make changes, or if we see that kids are not progressing, then we need to make some changes in our own teaching. Now, it says down at the bottom, the Texas example. So what the Texas example is that with self-regulated strategy development with a woman by the name of a professor at Texas A&M by the name of Kay Wucha Coomer. She's a uh, she does a lot of digital science stuff. She's developed assessments that students can take as they go through SRSD, and it'll identify places where they need extra practice. And if they need extra practice, then it has activities to help them. So it's built in digitally to what students do. And I think we're going to see more of that kind of thing as we move forward, where you get individualized help with a digital system. Um, and then I want to say something about what's not in the guide, and you're going to see a lot of things there. So these are things from meta-analysis that we've done with secondary students. One that was just published in 2023 in the Journal of Educational Psychology, where we looked at 350 something studies. Um, and here are some of the things that uh, we know make a difference. So when you engage students in inquiry or inquiry to gather information for what they're going to write about, it can have a positive effect on their writing. But this is like gathering concrete information. So let's say that a student wants to write something on social interaction. So during lunch, they might take data on how students socially interact, what kinds of issues come up, etc. And they take that information over, say, a 2 week period of time, and then they have to draw conclusions out of it. But that information is used to help them write something. That kind of inquiry, where they gather that kind of concrete information, um, improves the quality of what they write. Pre-writing activities, graphic organizers, looking at source material, reading before you write makes you a better writer, improves the quality of your text. I have word processing here. And I think probably the way of thinking about word processing, it makes it easier to write if your typing speed is reasonable. But it doesn't seem to have the same effects now that it used to, because I think it's so common. But we have word processing plus programs now that will have things like a planning program built into it, or prompts that ask you to do something, or help things. beyond spell checkers and grammar checkers, or they give feedback, or they make it possible to do multimodal text. The use of those kind of word processing plus programs and some instruction around them improve writing. Using writing as a tool for learning. Whenever we write about what we're learning in science, social studies, and mathematics, it improves our understanding and our retention of that information. Observing the effects of your writing. This has mostly been done in Europe, but let's say that you write a persuasive text and then you get the opportunity to see a couple of people, peers, talk about that text, what they liked about it, what they think might be constructively changed, etc. That can improve your writing. Or if it's something that you write on how to do something, seeing somebody else try to actually do it. Um, makes it clear to you the next time you do something like this, you need to pay a little bit more attention. Teaching students how to summarize, either by teaching them a strategy, such as, what's the main idea, marking out things that can be deleted or things that nature, or even kind of a behavioral approach where we start off giving students a summary of something that they've read, and then, we talk about how you do that, and then we start leaving things out of those expert summaries, and students have to fill it in, and we leave more out and more out to the point where they're writing the whole summary. Teaching students to critically analyze or be creative around writing has a positive effect. Teaching sentence construction, particularly sentence combining, which I talked about last week. Teaching grammar. Now, the issue here on teaching grammar is that you don't say, here's the definition, try it out, and, put the right grammar piece in this blank in this sentence, and then that's it. It means modeling how to do that grammar skill, practicing it, and applying it in your writing. For some kids, spelling instruction, I'm not suggesting that we do this for everybody, but spelling instruction can have a positive effect through middle school for some kids who have difficulty with teaching kids the texture, uh, text structure, its purposes and the structure, like mystery writing. Teaching stories probably doesn't help that much with older kids because they already know the structure of the story. But for informational text, mystery writing, things of that nature, it does. Computer assisted instruction, where computer provides either assistance during the writing process or teaches students grammar skills, sentence construction skills, etc. And then peers working together around process, planning, drafting, revising, and editing, but they need to have structure in terms of doing that. All of those things, we have evidence that works. We actually have quite a few tools at our disposal now that there's evidence-based practice that they work. I want to say a little bit about AI, and I want to leave some time for questions. And so in terms of our three recommendations, I'm going to take the middle one and talk a little bit about that, integrating writing and reading to emphasize key writing features. So let's think about writing from source material, which with the advent of Common Core has become, much more common because starting around fourth grade or so, students are expected to use source material in their writing. And in some states now, like Texas, we see their state assessments involving writing after reading material or source material. So if you're writing from regular source material, you have to, read each piece, you have to understand it and analyze it. And then as you read and you think about your intentions and goals for what you're writing, let's say it's a persuasive argument, let's say around immigration policies in the US now, a hot topic, okay? And a very contentious one. So you might be reading 3 or 4 source materials with different viewpoints on this. And what you're having to do is you have a particular goal to make a decision about which side of the argument you're going to select, and you're going to be thinking about, the pros and cons and where you want to go with this. But that means for each piece of text, you have to analyze it, think about it, and the next piece of text, you're building this kind of model as you analyze and think about it, where you're integrating that information from the two together and the information from your head together. And eventually you're going to come up with a plan for what you're going to say based upon the material in your head and that you're looking at in the source material. Now, let's think about that from writing from an AI perspective. And this is not an example I gave last week with the elementary guys. So when you generate AI text, you give it directions, okay? And if you say, you know, if you ask AI, to what are the pros and cons to immigration in the US under the Trump administration, okay? So what you would get back is, a list of pros and cons and stuff that's taken. You don't know where the source material comes from, but I'll come to that in a second. And you look at it and you think, well, that's not specific enough for what I want, and you add a new direction. Well, something happens. The text changes. So the text is not as stable in AI. And that's didn't happen when you had that text in front of you that was on paper. A second thing is the text is not as transparent. Okay. You don't actually know so well where this information came from unless the prompting provides you some information on that. So you have to evaluate this text with a particularly critical eye. And then a third thing is that you're actually co-constructed that text. So when you're doing this prompting, it's not AI generating a text. AI is generating a text in response to something that you're doing. You co-construct it. So all of a sudden, this has become much more complicated if we're integrating AI generated material into writing this persuasive text. And what that means is students are going to have to learn some new skills to be able to do that successfully. Okay. I'll say a little bit about the use assessment of students writing to inform instruction and feedback. We did a study with middle and high school students that was published last year, and we looked at feedback from AI, ChatGPT-4. There's a better version out now with 5, where we compared it to doctoral students who had quite a bit of experience teaching writing in the schools, and we trained them to give feedback. And ChatGPT-4 on 5 criteria that we looked at, like whether it was positive, whether it was constructive, whether it was detailed, things of that nature, did just about as well as the humans did. Now, both could have been better, be quite honest. But, given how little time teachers have in the classroom, that provides you with a pretty good source. But there are issues. ChatGPT is not always right. Sometimes teachers aren't. When I get feedback, I'm not always right. When people give me feedback, I don't think they're always right. So one of the things that we need to be sure if we're using AI or a large language model to give feedback is we want to be sure students keep their intentions and goals in mind, and they think about whether that feedback is actually accurate for what they write. So again, we need a little bit more skills in terms of writing. And that's going to bring me to kind of the last thing I'd like to say. Um, we want to ensure that AI remains a tool that we use. We're the boss, okay? Not a tool that takes the place of thinking. So I mentioned earlier that when we write, about something, whether it's something we read or something in a content class, it improves our understanding and the memorability of that information. So why is that the case? Well, when we write, we have to make decisions about what's important. Most kinds of writings require that we integrate that information together, as well as also integrate that with what we already know. And we put it in our own words, which means we handle it in some way. And anytime you handle information in a new way, it tends to help you know if you understand it or not and what you need to do. We also, basically rehearse the information again when we write about it. So it's not just like reading through something once or listening to it once. We're now engaged with it again. And one of the most powerful tools for learning is time, engaged. And so if AI writes something for us, we don't get much back in terms of new learning. There's a really interesting study with college students out of MIT right now that basically says if you're not engaged with writing and AI writes, you don't learn much. And I think that's probably true. And so we want to be sure that when we use AI as a writing partner, we use it in a way that if we do minimize thinking at all, or when we do, we want to be sure that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. So for example, if we've got an 11th grader who has physical issues in terms of creating manually text, then hey, why not have that person generate their ideas and have AI put it into text, and then they can look to revise that using voice speech text synthesis. We've taken some of the thinking out because when you create your sentences, you know, thinking's involved there, but we've used this in a way that's beneficial to our individual student. And so, but we want to think about that balance between thinking and the benefits of AI to the individual or to our class. Um, I actually think using this tool is going to require that we not only have the skills to write relatively well now, but we're going to have to pick up new skills as we're going to have to pick up new skills as well. So I want to end with this, and then we'll have some time for questions. My English teacher has made such a difference in my life. So this is like, why bother? He teaches like no other teacher I've known. He really makes us think not only about school, but about life. He cares so much about us learning. I've never seen a teacher that cared so much. I've learned more in 1 year from him than I have in any other class I've had. Now, of course, we all wish that's something that somebody says about us. And I've never known a teacher who didn't want to do their best with their students that they possibly could. And so, we're increasingly developing evidence-based practices that will help us do that. And I think one of the values of the practice guides is they present ideas that are doable in class, and there's evidence that they work. Again, the caution, you want to make sure they work with your student. Um, but they provide a really nice starting place for teaching writing to secondary students. So we have some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Graham. We do have, and I'm going to ask too, that I think we have time for some more too, as far as questions. So if people are, something jumps to mind, please put that in the chat and we'll get that out. I did see one that said, do you see the writing process in the guide working alongside the simple view of writing?
You know, well, I think the simple view of writing is simple, to be quite frank. Um, you know, and I think the simple view of reading, to be quite frank, is simple as well. And of course, that'll get me some heat from certain folks. Um, if you think about something like writing, I would say, let's think a little bit about what drives one from being a novice to competent to expertise. Now, most people don't, like if you're an artist, you can, kids can scribble, and some kids draw pretty well and become relatively competent, but there's going to be few people who are going to be exceptional artists. And, I think probably our goal at the school level is to move from novice to competence. And, there'll be some kids that we can foster along the way that, really are incredible writers. But in terms of most of the kids, we're moving to competence. And I don't mean that as a limiting factor. Reaching competence for us in writing would be a good thing, because I don't think we're there in terms of what we see with school age kids. I think their writing could be much better than what it is now. Um, so with that said, what are the things that drive our development? And Pat Alexander, who's at the University of Maryland in Human Development Department, somebody I truly love, both as a person and for their thinking, has a theory about what moves you along in these. And she says three things, and I'm going to add a fourth for writing. One is knowledge. So when you're first starting to learn about something, let's say that you're a little kid and you're learning about dinosaurs. So, you have a little bit of knowledge about dinosaurs, but the kids that are really interested in, they surprise you because they got a lot of knowledge. They can name that dinosaur, they can name it, but their knowledge over time about a particular topic or domain, it's fragmented initially, and then it becomes wider and connected, so that one thing makes you think about another. And so, when I was saying I was writing that preface to that book, and I thought about that, cartoon about with Yoda, it led to another idea, because even though you might not think of that cartoon and my fifth grade experience as being connected, they were connected in some way in my memory. And that actually, I enjoyed writing the first 4 paragraphs of that book because I wasn't writing like an academic. I was writing like a writer would do to try to, kind of catch my reader's attention. So knowledge is a very powerful tool for moving one forward. Strategic prowess is another. So initially, when we approach a problem, like if you're looking at kids planning in kindergarten or first grade, they brainstorm ideas. Very simple, right? But as we start, doing other types of tasks, our planning becomes more sophisticated. We have multiple goals. They're hierarchical, you know. So I might set a goal to write something to make, let's say I was writing something for, I think there may be still maybe 17 magazine, maybe it doesn't exist anymore. But if I was writing an article about kids with learning disabilities, I might want to say 3 things that are important that, about kids with learning disabilities. This wouldn't work for me, but I might want to try to be hip or something, or, at least appeal to somebody that's, 17 to 20. I might want to, I might have a goal to be humorous in places. There's a lot of different goals I could have, and some of these would be hierarchical. So my planning gets more sophisticated. My strategic prowess becomes more sophisticated, and that includes planning, evaluating, monitoring, revising, those kind of things over time. Motivation is also important. I become a more confident writer over time, and that drives whether I persevere on things when they get hard or I can't. I've had days where I've spent a full day writing a paragraph. That seems ridiculous, but it's been the case because I can't quite get that idea down. But you can see where these 3 things kind of drive development if you apply them to almost any domain. And then in the area of writing, I would add some things that can limit that development, and those include mastering or automatizing skills and sentence construction. So until you automatize handwriting and spelling or typing, they interfere with other writing processes. So, if all of us have experienced this, our hands not fast enough to keep up with our mind, an idea slips out and it's gone before we can get it down on paper. Sometimes we get it back, sometimes we don't. Um, Sentence construction, we want thinking to go on there, right? That's always got to involve thinking, but we want to also be facile. So when we get kids where they're more facile with sentence construction, guess what? Sentence skills get better, but also the quality of their text gets better because we freed up resources. And also, you got better sentences, you probably have better connected text and better thought out text. So skills play a role in terms of development with kids as well. Now, if we, took this to reading, I think you could apply the same thing, like decoding and fluency. Those are going to be important and limiting factors. So I tend to think of this in a little bit broader way. So, but I could put important, I could weight these. So I think motivation is important, but I don't think it's the most central one. My wife, I like to write, okay? My wife, who's a very good writer, better writer than I am, she says she likes to be done writing. So I actually enjoy the process. She enjoys being done with it. So she can still write well. Um, and she has a different motivation profile than I do. So I think probably that accounts for less of the variability in writing, say, than your knowledge about the topic or your knowledge about the type of writing you're doing or your thinking, the strategic process that goes on while you're writing. So I would expand that view of the simple view of writing, and especially as we think about development over time. So I know that was a really long response, but I never really gotten a chance to get that one out quite like that.
I love it. And I'm hearing a lot of things. Dr. Bulger was putting in the chat, referencing the active view. As far as things, I'm hearing things like, cognitive load. It's making me also think of like the instructional hierarchy model. So all of that is coming together for me. I saw a question from Dr. Hope too. So since we know there is a relationship between reading, writing for students in high school, do we have any data around morphology instruction, improving, reading, vocabulary, and spelling on writing, either quantity or quality?
Well, we clearly have evidence that morphology instruction improves spelling, and morphology instruction includes decoding. And my guess, I haven't looked at all the meta-analysis on morphology and reading. I can tell you in spelling, what we see is that spelling improves when it's taught, reading decoding improves or phonics improves, reading comprehension improves, and if there were enough studies, probably reading fluency improves as well. I think that's the connection between the two. The effect sizes are about a third of a standard deviation jump in reading fluency, but there's so few studies and there's a little bit of variability. It doesn't come as statistically significant, but as more studies come forward, it will. And morphology is really a key rocker for this. You can't really talk about spelling or word reading without morphology as once you get past some of the very earliest grades. Um, and in fact, another way of kind of thinking about something like spelling is, morphology is about meaning. Uh, but also in terms of spelling, think about angel and angelic, metal and metallic. You pronounce them differently, but there's keys to the meaning of each word by the key word in there, metal and angel. And one of the things that you often see being done in fifth and sixth grade or seventh grade with spelling instruction is taking advantage of those words that sound different, but their spelling is keyed somewhat similarly. And so they're presented together often in, if you have a list of spelling words to work on.
Great. Any thoughts on accommodations? I'm seeing, students that have significant needs in secondary. And so I see things like speech to text and scribing, and any thoughts on that impact there on where they're going?
Yeah. So, I think, when speech to text first came out, you'd have to say a word and pause and then say a word and pause and say a word. So it wasn't, it was limited in terms of what it can do. I was in Australia a couple of years ago where I worked during the summers, and I was coming around a corner. I'd walk along the river in Brisbane every morning. I was coming around a corner, and I saw about 75 or so high school kids, and they were all they weren't talking to each other visibly, but they were all on their phones talking. And I suspect some were talking to each other, but it was speech to text synthesis, right? So I mean, it's come leaps and bounds. It might be the most common mode of writing that exists now when you consider how much time we spend doing that. And so I think that's a very viable option for kids. There is, though, with every tool, you always want to ask, what's the drawback? And so there was a study that was done 1930s, 40s, 50s, somewhere in there, probably not the third, but it was with expert dictators. And I don't mean like Saddam Hussein. People used to use dictaphones, okay? And so it looked at people in the world of business and what they did as they wrote, because you'd have to speak in a dictaphone and then a secretary would listen to it and then write it out or type it out. They found that they spent 60% of their time planning, okay, in advance. So we did a study with sixth grade kids with learning disabilities, and um, they could write by hand, they could dictate, but we also taught them how to plan in advance. So, we had this kind of four conditions. They planned using the strategy for persuasive text that we taught as actually the stop and dare strategy. They just did whatever they normally would do for planning, and they dictated and they wrote. And I tell you, dictation and the planning together was really powerful for these kids. So the cautionary part here is that whatever the tool is, you want to think about what the disadvantages are. And the disadvantage to speech to text is that you may speak extemporaneously off the top of your head, without a lot of planning. And so, one idea leads to the next, leads to the next. That's not necessarily good writing at the secondary level.
Makes
And
sense.
I think AI is going to provide, there's disadvantages to AI, but it has the potential of providing persons with disabilities or special needs with some advantages that didn't exist before.
I feel like it's something that we're all kind of navigating and working and getting accustomed to. And I know teachers, there's cheating and there's doing the assignment and just asking AI, and it's hard to navigate all of that. So
Yeah, I'm not sure about the word cheating here. So let me say why, because I'm I'm a little worried about this word as it's being applied with AI. One way it's being applied is students. Students are cheating. Of course, some students are cheating, but the available evidence, at least right now, suggests that kids are cheating at about the same level they were cheating before. Um, some are now cheating with AI and some are not cheating with it, but some of the evidence suggests that that's not gone up. It's not meaning that some kids aren't cheating. We did a survey in Norway with 500 secondary teachers, and the biggest concern about AI use was ethical concerns. And they're right to be concerned about ethical things. But I don't think it's cheating when teachers use AI to improve their lessons or develop some part of their lessons. I think the challenge is going to be is right now, if you use AI to grade students' writing, not give feedback, but to grade it, the evidence isn't very strong that that's going to give you accurate scores compared to to expert human scores. We've done several studies with this, and the other studies that have done, basically where you give directions to use a rubric to score this without some kind of pre-training, some training models to make something like ChatGPT 4 or 5 better. It's not very accurate in comparison to humans who are who have some skill at doing this and some training at doing it. I'd be very leery about giving students grade based on AI. That I might consider cheating because there's not evidence that it works. But if a teacher can make their classroom instruction better in some way, any way they can do that, I think is open to use, reasonably to use.
Absolutely, fair enough. Then we have a question too. Is there any evidence about having students read their writing out loud for helping students to correct grammar, sentence structure, etc.?
There's one study I know of, and it's done by a special educator, a woman named Chris Espin. It was done in the 1980s, published in Exceptional Children. I think she was a doctoral student when she published it, and it caught my eye because it had kids read out loud orally, to make revisions in their papers. And what she did find is that kids were more likely to identify issues around things like grammar, sentence structure, etc. Now, the important thing to note, though, it didn't make them any better at making the corrections. Okay, it made you better at locating them. But if you misspell a word the first time, you might misspell it again the second time, and maybe not get it right unless you get some help or some other form of doing it. Now they did do better, but it didn't mean that they got better on that skill. It's basically a way of locating errors, and that can be helpful.
Interesting, yeah. Um, we've got like 2 more minutes left, but I don't know if we can fit this one in. Just you referenced that between the two practice guides, one you were allowed to give some things that had rationale, but maybe kind of minimal evidence, make recommendations, and then that shifted. I'm just wondering why that shift took place. Do you happen to know, is each practice guide kind of different criteria or different guidelines, or did that like
Well, so what it seemed like to me is that you know I I don't know this for certain, but I suspect Mathematica got a little bit of heat about not making all of the recommendations evidence-based. And in the elementary guide, one of our recommendations was to create a positive learning environment. Another one was students write. And I still couldn't make a recommendation based on evidence that increasing how much students write, either for elementary or secondary students, improves their writing. But I would never design a program where students didn't write. That's the game. That's what you're trying to get better at. You need to have a place to practice the skills that you're learning, and you need to have a purpose for engaging in that skill development. So um, I I think that might have been it, but I'm not certain.
Interesting. All right, awesome. Thank you so much. I know we have one more just slide. TRL MD is going to put something up about contact information, but I want to thank for sure Dr. Graham for sharing your time with us. I want to thank Keys to Literacy for your sponsorship so that people could attend this event for free. And I want to thank everybody who tuned in tonight and was engaged and hung out with us. And I hope to see you at future events as well, and I hope that you all connect with us online. But thank you so much and have a great night.
And thank you, and Hope, it was good seeing you.
It was great to see you too.